it's really hard to be positive on tech right now. And you feel like you're missing something. You feel like you're not getting the joke. And
because every dip you've bought into this year, you've gotten your face ripped off.
Correct. And you just don't, it's hard to predict a bottom on it. And so you just don't want to do that.
On a dollar basis, the biggest business loser of this year was big tech. And I think that you saw three things happen, which I think are important for the future.
And I think what was interesting about the FTX failure is it wasn't just a failure due to fraud, but it revealed so many parts of kind of, call it, systemic laziness and systemic kind of blind eye and systemic bias that allowed and enabled this to happen.
As stocks and crypto prices fell in 2022, investors kept trying to time the dip and buy more in hope of huge returns. Unfortunately, for those that made huge investments in hope that the prices had bottomed, they guessed wrong. Chamath Palihapitiya and David Freiberg both discuss what impacted the two markets in 2022 and what to expect in 2023. You really don't want to miss a single bit of this. And if you're not yet subscribed, you need to so that you don't miss any uploads. Now let's get right into it.
I mean, I whiffed. It just completely missed the global macro shift that we embarked on in full force starting in Q1 of this year. It is the most important business story of the year. It's just like we have an absolute complete regime change. And by the way, that regime change is so complete and so thorough that it even touched Japan just a few days ago, where Japan, who finally yielded on this idea of we're going to have negative interest rates and yield curve control, even they finally broke and raised rates. So it is an absolute worldwide sea change in how we need to think about risk. And I think that's worth talking about a little bit later in the show, but that was the single biggest business story of the year.
About all economies in the world were negatively impacted by the changes in global macroeconomic conditions in 2022. While many countries, especially developing nations and emerging economies, experienced double-digit inflation, nations like the United States and the United Kingdom were not left out. Both experienced record-breaking inflation numbers that hadn't been seen in decades, and also scored some negative records in the assets market. Market value of about $1.6 trillion was wiped out from the S&P 500's 10 biggest losers in 2022. The shares of Meta, Tesla, and Match all dropped more than 60% within the year. 70% of the listed companies all suffered huge devaluation. By the third quarter, we began to witness layoffs from the biggest tech companies in the US and the world. All of this is evidence for how much of a downturn 2022 was for investors in the stock market and in big tech stocks in particular. But one country seemed exempt from all the harsh economic overtures. While every central bank was hiking interests and pumping on the interests on their long-term bonds, the Bank of Japan remained defiant. But on the 20th of December 2022, the BOJ had to yield and reverse its stance on maintaining negative interest rates. Core consumer inflation had hit a fresh 40-year high of 3.7%. Bank of Japan Governor Haruhiko Kuroda said that the increased interest rate was a technical measure aimed at improving the way the bond market works and in no way was a form of monetary tightening like the US Fed is doing. Let's hear David Freiberg's take on this topic.
Last November, I predicted energy and defense to be the best performing stocks for this year. Sachs is right. I think defense is up 40%. So I kind of went with the bigger oil and gas companies are up, across the board about 47% in terms of equity value in the public markets year to date, compared to the S&P being down about 20%. So over the short term, I would argue oil and gas companies, but I think that over the long term, there were a couple of big breakthrough moments that I would give kind of, the winner in business that will benefit over the long term to OpenAI and to Fusion startups. And we'll talk more about why for those two, obviously later when we get to the biggest winner in tech and science. But yeah, short-term oil and gas, they benefited from the supply constraints and the conflict in the Ukraine. And then longer term, I think OpenAI and Fusion startups.
Last year, David Freiberg accurately predicted that this would be a big year for energy stocks and defense stocks. And was he right? Russia invaded Ukraine, and this pumped energy stocks, and defense companies had more contracts, thus boosting their revenues. Energy stocks are the clear winners for 2022. S&P 500's energy component had gained a jaw-dropping 50% towards the end of the year. The defense component of the S&P 500 is also up about 40%. It looks likely to remain strong in 2023 as the United States needs to award more contracts to replenish its weapons stockpile after massive donations to Ukraine.
On a percentage basis, David absolutely nailed it. Sachs absolutely nailed it. On a dollar basis, the biggest business loser of this year was big tech. And I think that you saw three things happen, which I think are important for the future. The first was it was the most crowded trade, both by professional money managers as well as retail. And that fever finally broke in the second half of this year. And now going into these last few weeks, you're seeing a lot of panicked selling to cover losses and other things. So I think that number one, that happened. Number two, regulators basically said, we're going to go after these guys every single which way we can. Mm-hmm. And then number three, I think it started to change the innovation cycle where people now actually believe that they can't outspend because folks won't tolerate it. And the things that they're spending their money on seem kind of foolish. And so I think big tech is probably not discussed enough, but it was a huge loser for this year.
I mean, this one's just a simple FTX. I mean, that was such a incredible revelation of the scale of the scam and the fraud and the craziness that went on. And I think what was interesting about FTX is it had implications not just for crypto and not just for kind of offshore regulatory, and not just for fraud, but also for the investors. We had a whole debate about whether the press and journalists failed to kind of, appropriately investigate this guy rather than give him accolades because he said the right things, which he said he did over IM. And investors failed to do relevant amounts of due diligence or form a board and have proper governance over him because they wanted to be part of the hot new thing and everyone had capital to deploy. And I think what was interesting about the FTX failure is it wasn't just a failure due to fraud, but it revealed so many parts of kind of, call it, systemic laziness and systemic kind of blind eye and systemic bias that allowed and enabled this to happen. It was really a revealing kind of failure. And that's why I kind of gave it the award.
2023 doesn't look reassuring for big tech companies. It's possible we haven't seen the bottom yet. Many experts agree that the economy would slip into a recession in 2023. If that happens, then the troubles continue for big tech companies. As Chamath rightly said, there's a shift in the priorities of consumers. It's little wonder that Apple shares are nosediving and interest in the company's products is declining. The biggest business news in 2022 was perhaps the news on the FTX collapse. No doubt there's reason to think more carefully about investing in the cryptocurrency market. There are just way too many uncertainties right now. Even venture capitalists are walking away from the FTX saga with a lot of hard lessons. Due diligence cannot be overemphasized. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave it a like and we'll see you in the next one.